Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I've got a video from a channel called Abrahamic Faith entitled Evidence for Jesus' Resurrection from a Historian. Spoiler alert, when they're presenting any of their so-called evidence, they'd never actually cite any historians. Let's take a look.
Paula Fredrickson, Boston University. I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I don't know what they saw. But I know that as a historian, they must have seen something.
So that seems to be a quote from Paula Fredrickson. I don't think this is Paula Fredrickson speaking, and the reason I mention this is because the intro was rather ambiguous as to whether this was a quote or an introduction to the speaker, something that is further muddled by the title of the video, which, if you'll remember, is Evidence for Jesus' Resurrection from a Historian. Is it possible to do one of those SIC things? Is that sick? Is that how you would pronounce that? Can I do that verbally so you guys know that I know how horribly titled this is? Not to be overly pedantic here, but here's the fixed title for you. Back on topic, which historian is providing evidence for the resurrection? Who is speaking? The only other historian you mention is Gerd Ludemann, and I'm pretty certain that he doesn't sound like you. I mean, Ludemann and Fredrickson do look a bit like each other, though, you know, as long as you're looking through a grainy, low-quality video. But yeah, no, they really don't look like each other at all. So, are you Paula Fredrickson putting on a British accent? Or are you a third party reading something authored by Paula Fredrickson? Or are you just hoping that people will assume that you are Paula Fredrickson and as such are borrowing from her credibility as an historian without actually having any of your own credibility? Now, I see from the About section of your YouTube channel that you have many interests and a polymath outlook on the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Now, far be it from me to criticize someone for not having a degree in a field that they make YouTube videos about, you know, seeing as how I have no scientific degrees at all and I regularly make videos regarding evolutionary biology, but at least I don't try to make it look like I am an expert in the field with such a dishonest tactic.
Is there any reason to believe that an extraordinary event like the resurrection actually happened?
Not that I can see.
We might be encouraged to know that since the first Christians made the claim that the resurrection was Jesus' physical body coming to life and leaving an actual, literal tomb, as opposed to simply a spiritual belief that Jesus had come back again as a ghost or was alive in their hearts as a memory, it can be studied in the same way other historical events can be. Like Hannibal's invasion, complete with the elephants, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, or the Broncos being crushed by the Seahawks in Super Bowl 48.
I don't follow. Why does a miraculous claim involving a physical body mean that it can be studied in the same way as a non-miraculous event? Why do we study it differently if they say they saw his spirit than if they say they saw his living body? Does that make their accounts more credible? If so, why? One of the first rules when trying to determine if an account is historically credible or not is to ask if it is describing things that are actually possible. The more miraculous the contents, the less likely it is to be an actual historical account. I'd say seeing an actual person coming back to life is far less likely than having a vision or a dream of them, so it seems to me that a spiritual resurrection would place the Gospels as being closer to being actual history than a physical resurrection would.
Historical research is well respected, even though, unlike scientific research, you cannot place historical events under a microscope or contain them to a lab.
No, history is subject to interpretation by historians, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a type of consensus of historians. For instance, most historians will agree that the character of Jesus in the Bible was based on a real person. So yes, the study of history is respectable and in a large part reliable, and when it isn't reliable, a good historian will make note of the fact that there is reason to doubt some aspects of their histories, and will point out why.
Historians put reports together from written sources and eyewitnesses, or anything else that was known from the time and place of the events, to reach reasonable conclusions about what may have actually happened.
I am largely in agreement with that view. Go on.
While many pieces of evidence can be used to point to the reality of Jesus' resurrection, we will focus on 3. Number 1, the early church exploded on the scene of the ancient world, with the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead as their central proclamation.
So let me get this straight. the church got big fast while making a miraculous claim, therefore the claim must be true? Is that really what you just said there?
Many movements are gradual in building momentum, and when it comes to larger-than-life, legendary or miraculous characteristics claimed by these movements about their leaders, those ideas usually take decades and sometimes even centuries to develop.
Okay, that's nice. What's your point? The speed at which an idea spreads has no bearing on the truth of that idea. Just think of every time you see that news story about Mars coming so close to Earth that it'll be the size of the moon. It has been thoroughly debunked repeatedly, but it still manages to be spread and believed almost every year. With the wealth of human information at our fingertips, how many people fact-check everything before they share it? It's not very many. And what about people in antiquity? How would they go about fact-checking? You share things that are the most eye-catching while still maintaining a semblance of credibility. It has nothing to do with the truth of what you are sharing. The idea of the resurrection went viral. That doesn't make it true.
From what we know about Christianity, the claim that Jesus rose again from the dead was made from the very start, serving as this new religion's central idea.
Not necessarily, but even granting you that just because an idea catches on does not mean it's true.
A passage that is thought to reflect the very earliest Christian belief, a founding Christian leader writes, "I want to remind you of the good news I proclaimed to you. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, was buried, and on the third day rose again from the dead." Within a very short time, this movement had taken the ancient world by storm, built on the testimony of those who claimed they had seen Jesus alive after death. There is every indication that they must have seen something.
Who is this they, I wonder? I know about Paul, but do we know who the rest were? I mean, the earliest mention of the resurrection that I am aware of is Matthew 28, which was written sometime in between year 50 and year 70, so at a minimum, this is 17 to 37 years after the supposed events before the first mention of there ever actually being a resurrection. The earlier gospel, Mark, doesn't even bother to mention it. The book just ends when Jesus is put in a tomb. So the earlier you go chronologically, the less miraculous the story becomes. All this to say that there isn't really much evidence that the Christian movement started with the resurrection at its center, and a case can certainly be made that the resurrection narrative grew up around the other Jesus stories, which, as it happens, is exactly what one would expect to see if we were looking at a person who lived a life in which they didn't necessarily perform any miracles, but managed to garner a following, and then had a posthumous legend grow around them.
Number 2.
Wait, that really was it for number 1? Just that it was an idea that spread quickly? You know you're supposed to lead with your strongest arguments, right? I hope for your sake that wasn't a strong one.
The earliest followers of Jesus claimed to be eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection, and went to their deaths proclaiming it.
Okay, that's nice. It's actually a little stronger of an argument than your last one, actually, so yeah, next time lead with your strongest argument, have your weakest ones in the middle, and end on one that is ideally equally as strong as your first one. So you might want to think about restructuring a bit, but all that aside, so what? People die for mistaken beliefs all the time. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't even mean that they believe what they died for. I mean, Joseph Smith, the man who founded Mormonism, was killed because of it, and if anyone was in a position to know for sure whether or not Mormonism is a lie, he was it. So I ask you the same question I ask anyone who says nobody would die for a lie. Are you Mormon? If not, then clearly you agree that sometimes it is possible not only for people to die for a lie, but for people who know full well that it is a lie to die for it. So, but if you are a Mormon, then I guess that's checkmate. You got me. I'll convert, but only if you send me my magic underwear in advance.
Now, we all know people die for their beliefs. That does not make their beliefs true.
Agreed. Next is when you say that they were in a position to know whether or not their beliefs were actually true or false, right?
But one thing it does for all of them, it is a very strong indicator that they believed what they were saying.
Again, I am inclined to agree with that. But it still doesn't make what they were saying actually true.
It's been said, liars make lousy martyrs. The early followers of Jesus claimed first to have seen Jesus die and rise again from the dead. Their deaths are an indication that they certainly believed they had. They must have seen something.
Why must they have actually seen something? Most of the earliest books of the New Testament were written by Paul, a man who freely admitted that he never set eyes on Jesus' physical body. He saw him in a vision. Scientists nowadays know several ways in which these things can happen, none of which involve an actual resurrection of any kind.
Number 3. Jesus' resurrection was seen by his earliest followers and friends.
Wow, you didn't even go to the "they were in a position to know if it was a lie" argument. You just camped out at "they died for it, therefore." Like you said.
Now, we all know people die for their beliefs. That does not make their beliefs true.
But you didn't offer anything other than "they died for it, so they must have believed it." So you know what? I'll give you this one. Even though there's very little evidence to suggest that they actually did die for it, see Paulogia's video that I have referenced in the past for more on that, I'll let you have it. They died for it. This then constitutes evidence that they believed it. Point granted. Still does nothing as far as proving that what they believed actually happened. Also, side note, when you say Jesus' resurrection, it sounds like you're saying Jesus' erection, so you might want to be careful with your enunciation there.
But, in addition, a very unusual thing happened around the same time.
Was it the zombie apocalypse? Because the Bible says that happened around the same time.
2 men who were self-described skeptics, even enemies of the idea of Jesus' divinity, turned from their skepticism to claim that they had seen the resurrected Jesus.
Two guys changed their minds about something? Well, that seals it. It's gotta be true. Even though the only place we hear about Paul being a skeptic is from himself, and assuming that he was telling the truth about it, all that says is that 2 guys changed their minds once. You know, people change their minds all the time. That doesn't mean that their claims are true. Hell, most atheists were once believers, and they all changed their minds. Does that make atheism true? The correct answer is no. No, it does not.
The first was Jesus' own brother James. Historians are confident that we have good information regarding James, and we know he began as a skeptic over Jesus' claims to divinity.
Which historians and which sources? I would really like to know. Also, as far as I'm aware, Jesus never actually claimed divinity for himself. He did on occasion say that he was not God, so really it sounds like James might have just been part of one of those early Christian sects that held the opinion that Jesus was not the actual Son of God.
From what we know, he appears to have thought Jesus was decidedly not the Son of God, but also that his brother was a little on the kooky side, which, if you have a brother, you may be able to relate to.
Yeah, but if your brother actually was the literal Son of God, you might notice that there was something different about him. I mean, think about it. You grow up with someone who is actually God incarnate. How dense would you have to have been to not at least notice that he was, say, very wise, for instance? Maybe you don't accept that he is the Son of God, but if he actually was the Son of God, how would it ever be possible for you to even think that he was crazy?
But somehow, James makes a complete turnaround in his view of Jesus, and the explanation he gives is the resurrected Jesus appeared to him.
So he had a vision, or was it a physical apparition this time? You made a really big deal at the beginning about it being Jesus, in the flesh, physical. I know for a fact that Paul never claimed to have physically seen Jesus, so there's half your finishing argument gone. Did James see him physically for sure?
He must have seen something.
Maybe so, but it is an awfully big jump to go from "they must have seen something" to "the something they saw was a specific dead guy brought back to life, totes for realsies." I find myself unable to make that connection, even giving you the benefit of the doubt and assuming that they were telling the truth as far as they knew.
Then there was a man named Saul of Tarsus. He not only did not believe in Jesus, but when the news about him began to travel, he believed this new movement was a dangerous and destructive idea. He took it upon himself to oppose believers, even violently. He had people killed and put in prison just for believing in the resurrection.
Again, this is all very nice, but it does nothing to prove the resurrection. I've never even seen a source other than Paul himself that says he persecuted Christians before his conversion, and not even he will claim to have actually seen a physical Jesus. The closest he comes is a vision. So some form of hallucination seems far more likely to me than a dead guy actually having come back from the dead. How often did Paul have visions? Did he perhaps have an undiagnosed medical condition? It does stand to reason, though, that if he actually was involved in persecuting Christians, that the subject matter of Christianity may have been on his mind quite a bit, even pre-conversion. I can't imagine that early Christians wouldn't have tried to convert him in desperation as he sent them to be executed, so he definitely knew the rhetoric. Add an undiagnosed condition that can cause occasional hallucinations, possibly some guilt over having sent a bunch of harmless kooks to their deaths, and bam! Hallucination of the guy they all worship. That might also explain part of why Christianity grew so rapidly. If he were actually a well-known Christian hunter, having him turned Christian in an age where hallucinations were seen as spiritual communication of one sort or another, then that could be quite persuasive. I mean, hell, it's so persuasive that you guys are still using it today, despite knowing that there are perfectly natural, non-miraculous causes of visions.
Then suddenly, Saul does one of the most amazing 180s in the history of 180s. He goes from sworn enemy of the new faith to one of its most passionate and vocal promoters.
Yep. Like I said, they were living in a time when people would purposefully imbibe some sort of hallucinogenic substance or other in order to commune with the gods. Do you believe everything that the Oracle at Delphi predicted? Because that's the same quality of evidence that you're currently bringing to the table. Also, just another friendly reminder that you insisted at the beginning, as if it were quite important, that your witnesses all saw Jesus' actual body, and so far at least half of them have not. Just for the record, I did look it up now. The Bible does say that James saw a physically risen Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15:7. You know, Corinthians, the book written by Paul. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that tidbit.
What happened? According to him, the resurrected Jesus appeared to him.
In a vision, as in not physically.
He went to his death, never backing off that claim. He must have seen something.
Except that it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible how Paul died, or that he kept the faith until his death. Now, there are plenty of extra-biblical sources for that, though, so I will grant you that point. I just wanted to point out that one of the most important figures of the early church managed to die without a word being written about it in the final canonized accounts. Seems a bit odd, if you ask me.
Atheist New Testament scholar Jed Ludman. It must be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ.
Sure, he's the expert, not me. I can agree that many people in the early church had experiences that they believed to be an apparition of the resurrected Jesus. But again, this is not evidence that it actually happened. That's it for this video. They still never mentioned why it was important that people had seen a physically resurrected Jesus rather than a spiritually resurrected one. I don't quite get that, especially when one of your main talking points was about Paul, a guy who never even claimed to have seen a physical Jesus. Also, you never did clear up which historians were presenting evidence for the resurrection. You just sandwiched your own opinions between two historians. You even called Gerd Ludman an atheist, which I'm having trouble verifying. He certainly didn't get along with the religious leaders at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Göttingen. Sorry about the pronunciation there. I know I botched that. That's where he taught. He did say that the person of Jesus is insufficient as a foundation of faith, once most of the statements about him were proved to be later interpretations by the community. So maybe he was an atheist, but he just might have been a more liberal Christian. But really, who cares? It's not like that quote from him at the end does anything to prove the resurrection. The only thing that the two historians that you quoted says is that the guys who founded the early church probably actually believed what they were saying. That's it. Nothing about that says anything about even a tiny possibility of a dead guy coming back to life. Anyways, remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time.